This is Keith Ward with Visual Studio Magazine, and joining me now is speaker Vishwas Lele. And what do you think is the biggest thing to come along recently in Azure in terms of the updates?
Right. Let me answer your question in two ways. From a developer's perspective, we have a whole new set of tooling built into Visual Studio to manage and to work with Windows Azure in a more productive manner. Whether it is, being able to configure the properties for Windows Azure inside Visual Studio, whether it is to be able to look at the table storage and other services from inside Visual Studio. And so from a developer tooling perspective, we have that. From a purely functionality perspective, I think things like the Azure websites, the new mobile services capability that went GA during the Build conference, those are huge improvements. The media services going live is another important improvement. And the one I will call out, which is one which is sticking in my mind most recently, just announced 3 days back, is so we always had, for a few months anyways, we had the capability to do an always on instance of SQL Server. So you could have primary and secondary all in Azure. But up until this week, you had to do a manual step of failing over from primary to secondary. And now, Windows Azure provides a fully compliant SQL Server always-on configuration. And this is enabled by, for the first time, the ability to have floating IP addresses. And that's what makes it possible. So this just came out, such a big thing came out just 3 days back. And a very important capability for people who are looking to use Windows Azure to set up their SQL Server and to do it in a fault-tolerant manner.
Okay, great. Now you had mentioned the tighter integration between Azure and Visual Studio previously. How much more efficient do you think that's going to make developers who are, of course, working in Visual Studio?
So I think it'll have a huge impact because if you look at things like Windows Azure websites, today the experience is very similar to the experience you would have when you're deploying that website to an on-premises resource, right? You develop it like you develop it. And then you can, inside the Visual Studio project, say publish, and you can set many different parameters directly and be able to do that. Take another example. If you have a website and that you're trying to debug it, up until now you had to go grab a log, bring it to your machine and take a look. Now you can take the output of a website and look at it directly inside Visual Studio. These are huge productivity enhancers in my mind.
Because you don't have to go outside the IDE anymore to do any
That is correct.
Stuff. Great. So one of the things that Scott Guthrie mentioned in his keynote this morning was test and dev, and that seems to be a good way for developers who are unfamiliar with using Azure to get into it. What does Azure have on the test and dev side that is going to interest developers?
Right, so Keith, that's an excellent question, first of all, because you had asked me this question and I said I'm going to process it in the back of my mind. And you've hit upon something which I think is probably the single most important development for the development community in general. And that is my ability to set up a test and dev server within Windows Azure. And here are the key things. The number one enabler is the MSDN license mobility, which is only available in Windows Azure. So what that means is if you're an MSDN customer, you get to take the MSDN licenses and run them in Windows Azure. And that's not enough. You can also get, based on the kind of MSDN subscription you have, you get a quota for free to play with. And then beyond that, if you're an MSDN subscriber, you get lower rates for setting up servers. So these three things combined together, somebody said to me, Windows Azure is my data center, and I was talking to a .NET developer. And the idea is that I can write my code into Visual Studio, and now using my MSDN license, be able to deploy it in a dev test environment. I can do load testing with it. Windows Azure has a preview offering called the Elastic Load Testing Service. So not only can I deploy it to an MSDN server, I can do load testing with this. So it opens up many, many possibilities. And imagine taking your nightly build, for example, and combining it with a script that takes your nightly build output and deploying it to Windows Azure, standing up a server and deploying it and having your testers come in and test it. It's a very powerful scenario.
The license transfer, if I recall, that's a fairly recent change too in itself, isn't it?
It is a fairly recent change. I think it came about in June. Uh,
And there was a lot of outcry. I mean, for this, and I guess that's one of the things about the faster release cycle. I had heard a number of developers complain that they couldn't use their MSDN licenses
That's correct.
with Azure, and in a very short time after I was hearing these complaints, it was added. I mean, that sounds like Microsoft being responsive to customers.
Absolutely, and I think that that's a very important point there as well. You know, it allows them to get intelli data on what people want, what developer community wants very quickly if you release a feature. And then cloud analytics allows them, clearly they know how many people are using which service. Combine these two things and you have a recipe for, you know, trying to give back what the community wants. So I think that goes hand in hand with the agile model of building services. You know, gone are the days you take 2 years to build something and out comes a product which people don't want and people have certain reservations about. So it might be much better to go in an incremental manner and just common sense, and I think it works well.
Right. Finally, one of the things that is of interest to the dev community these days is DevOps. So the integration of development with the operations side, and it's not uncommon to hear developers complain about having to take sometimes a week, 3 weeks, sometimes months, I have heard, to get the IT department to spin up a VM for them. You know, all kinds of processes and paperwork. Now, if you use Azure, you can literally have it done in minutes. I mean, that seems like a big thing.
You know, that is a very important thing, Keith. I think Scott said it this morning, that the fact that in a cloud environment, you don't have to wait around for someone to provision resources for you is liberating. I think these were his exact words. But I think going back to your point, I think developers have a responsibility, and if you allow me to, I recorded a course for Pluralsight where I talked about, you know, how should developers be thinking of Windows Azure infrastructure as a service? And people came up to me and said, you know, why should developers learn about this infrastructure as service capability? And because, you know, traditionally developers have designed the product, built it, and then thrown over the wall for IT pros to install it. And my answer is this: in the new world, infrastructure as a service, we have a number of things that are different from previously. Number one, we need to build an architecture which scales with the business. We just don't build an architecture which we think will be required because based on our experience, the database has been a bottleneck. So we scale by business. And secondly, the fault tolerance mechanism in infrastructure service is very different than a traditional environment. You could throw a new machine, move your code over. So these are, in my mind, important architectural decisions that developers need to be involved in. So I think learning just a bit of automation can make a developer far more productive. And I like to think of my data center, and the way I describe it to developers is, think of your data center as an object model, essentially. So imagine, can I enumerate through all the machines that are in my data center? And once I get the machine object, can I enumerate through all the storage and routers and network? If I can do that all programmatically, I can build a more cost-effective system.
Sounds like a no-brainer on a lot of levels.
I think it's very important that developers get involved there.
Vishwas Lele, Windows Azure, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Keith, for your time. Yep.